Do you think US underestimated Ukraine?
Again, I'd like to think that I did not, but obviously there are a lot of observers who did, who were surprised. You know, you may recall in the very beginning, I said, this is, you know, don't overestimate what the Russians are going to do at Kyiv. By the way, keep in mind as well that Kyiv is larger in just sheer surface terms than New York City. New York City is a little over 300 square miles. Kyiv is over 320 square miles. So it's a vast, vast area. You have very few skyscrapers. Again, I've been to Kyiv, Kharkiv, Donbass, Crimea even, the year before it was seized, Lviv, and over a number of years. And by the way, the very first time I should acknowledge was during the final year of the Soviet Union. So again, a lot of familiarity there. And again, there's an awful lot that about just sheer heart. You know, Clausewitz and others have all noted the importance of, again, you know, the moral is to the physical as 3:1. And I think it's more than that in this situation, because this is urban combat at the end of the day. And urban combat is exceedingly difficult. It is very soldier intensive. I did the math very early on, and I said that there's no way that Russia will be able to successfully to occupy the whole country. They may not even be able to occupy Kyiv. Now they will destroy a lot of it, tragically, in a horrific way. And they are indeed doing a lot of that right now. But again, I saw something in the Ukrainian soldiers, their leaders and so forth, 3 years or so ago when I was there, that really was quite heartening, quite inspirational. And again, you can't teach that, you can't impart that, you can't develop it. I mean, you can improve on it, but it's either there or it's not. And then, of course, what has happened with the invasion has galvanized this unbelievable level of resistance by Ukrainian forces. I mean, the fact is that you can verify this, but I don't think that Ukrainian support for the government 6 months ago was universal. I think there were a lot of questions about it. I mean, again, we follow this very, very carefully. You know, was there going to be more work in anti-corruption? What about the judicial system? What about, you know, this and that? And I think all of those questions have gone away. This is about the homeland. And of course, that's one other huge factor. You are fighting for your survival, for your freedom, for your homeland. You are fighting on home soil. You have the home field advantage, as we say in athletics, and you know that field really well. Obviously, the Russians do not, and it turns out that the Russian soldiers don't have their heart in this. They have questions about it. They weren't even alerted to the fact they were actually going to go into combat until, in some cases, the day before. Some weren't even sure where they were, why they're attacking a country with which they share such a common heritage, often other aspects of their social makeup and so forth. And so again, I'd like to think that some of us recognize this. I know that Ambassador Herbst did as well at the Atlantic Council. There are others that have real deep experience, much deeper than I have, with Ukraine and its people and its military. But I think it doesn't take a huge amount of time. You know, I was there for a number of days, and it doesn't take a huge amount of time to get a sense of how durable, how tough, again, to come back to that word, Ukrainian soldiers can be, and they are, and so are the people and the leadership.
Thank you. So one question is from the Ukrainian audience. We're interested to learn about how NATO and West, you know, the US, British, the EU decision-making works. Is this more about political elites? Is it about public pressure? How they interact? Is it about bureaucracy? How come that the sanctions, as we slightly touched on this in the first question, sanctions were implemented originally almost impossible, but suddenly they could be implemented so quickly. You know, why no-fly zone is impossible. So just so we understand the structure and engineering of this, so that we have a better feel of what's possible, what's not. That's important for us also to know.
Sure. Yep. So the decision-making body of NATO is the North Atlantic Council. And that actually is constructed of the heads of government of the 30 NATO countries. And that's really the decision-making body. Now you have what are called the permanent representatives of these countries, the North Atlantic Council representatives at NATO headquarters in Brussels. And on a number of issues, they can actually resolve the issues with guidance from their capital. And then you have the NATO Military Committee, which provides the military advice to the ambassadors and ultimately to the heads of government. When it starts to move very rapidly, this can actually move quickly. In other times, it can be very, very slow. It can be maddeningly slow. And I speak from a degree of experience. I was a 4-star NATO commander, also a US 4-star commander in Afghanistan, dual hatted, as we say. I was a 3-star NATO commander and 3-star US in Iraq. The 4-star position in Iraq, I was strictly US-led coalition. And I was a 1-star NATO officer in Bosnia, again, with a US hat that was doing the war criminal hunt and then counterterrorism. But again, I've been to the North Atlantic. My father-in-law was actually the NATO military representative back in the Cold War days, and all the way back to when I was a speechwriter for the NATO commander and even a lieutenant. We were part of the NATO Allied Command Europe land mobile force. And again, sometimes it can move quickly, and we've seen that. But that's normally the exception rather than the rule. Normally it can be quite time consuming. There will be, however, there will be red lines, if you will. And I think the red line that has emerged and become, if you will, more bright red, in part because of Putin rattling the nuclear saber, is the resistance, unwillingness to get into a direct, say, US-Russian confrontation or NATO-Russia confrontation. Now, I should point out that in many respects, the US obviously has to be the foundation militarily for any significant action of NATO. The US doesn't just spend more than all of its 29 NATO allies together, it spends more than twice as much as all of them. And then so you have the US up here, then you have, say, the UK and France down here, and then in Italy, maybe Germany a little bit, and then sort of everybody else. If you don't have the country that's up here as the foundation, as the leader, as the base piece, you literally can't have the others. And the European leaders don't like this. But of course, they don't have the means to, even if they spend 2% of GDP or more, it nowhere will close that gap. That's just a reality. And so when the US decided to withdraw from Afghanistan, a decision that I criticized, and also the lack of adequate consultation in European terms, at least, the Europeans, although they wanted to stay in Afghanistan, could not stay without the United States. So I would just point out how significant US leadership, US actions, and everything else are. That does not mean, however, that other countries cannot have a very significant role. I would credit the United Kingdom for being the first to fly C-17 wide-body cargo aircraft into Ukraine with anti-tank weapons. I think it was 3 or 4 days before the US actually got to that, although we'd provided them before. But this is a new augmentation. Again, you see the very significant action by Germany. So individual countries' actions can, in a sense, as we say in the military, they're walking point for the rest of the alliance. They're out ahead of the rest of the alliance, and the rest of the alliance watches, they see what happens in response, and then join that. Normally, again, it is the US that is doing that, but a number of the other countries can have a very significant role. And right now, the other reality is that the new frontline countries, if you will, the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Slovakia, in particular, are of increased importance. Arguably, Turkey is as well when it comes to the Strait and so forth into the Black Sea. So that's sort of how NATO operates. And here you have also overlap with the EU, with some additions and some exceptions, the UK being one of those now. That's also very significant. And if the EU as a body decides to take an action in financial or economic terms overall, that can be very, very substantial, because it is, very nearly in aggregate, it is similar to the size, I'd say, of probably China in aggregate, not the US, especially with the loss of the UK. But again, very, very significant. And so once again, you put all of these together, and then don't forget Japan and other major players around the world. All of this comes together, and what the leadership of the US and others are trying to do, working together, is to orchestrate all of this going forward. Again, the latest will be, I think, some form of sanctions on Russia's export of crude oil.